Hi everybody, Jorge here, and today I want to talk about the spot effect. So, the spot effect is a very common relational dynamic that I think most of us have firsthand experienced in our relationships and seen in the relationships between other people. And it is basically the fact that when people have some shit within them, they are far more likely to work that shit out on those who are less privileged than they and on those who stay lower in the power hierarchy. At the same time, looking very good and behaving very good for those who are more privileged than they are and who stay higher in the power hierarchy. So, as a quite an underprivileged person, as a person who had many unearned disadvantages starting off in many areas of life, I have come across this phenomenon more or less my entire life. But for the most of my life, I remained gaslit by the cultural messages that rationalized and normalized the hypocrisy and abuse of privileged people in my life. So I was kind of brainwashed into the impression that I was making the thing up, that I was making up that this abusive dynamic took place. And only in 2016, when I read the novel The Fault in Our Stars, when I watched the movie and read the novel The Fault in Our Stars, I found this quote that kind of put my reality back together. And this quote read, "You can see who people truly are by the way they treat waiters and secretaries." So you know this feeling when someone puts the right words around an experience that you've been struggling to verbalize for years. And so when I read the quote, when I kind of finally realized that it wasn't just something I was making up, but it was the thing that other people also noticed, over the next few years, as I received my social work education, I explored this effect thoroughly through the lens of social work, analyzing my numerous past experiences along with the stories of people I got to interview. And today I want to share with y'all what I learned about the spot effect and, most importantly, the implications that it has for our relationships and also for the accuracy with which we judge other people in our lives. So the SPOT effect is kind of SPOT effect is an acronym, and it stands for the Social Pyramid One-Way Transparency Effect. I find that visual metaphors and kind of mnemonic acronyms are very helpful because they allow us to recognize and identify some very confusing and emotionally disturbing experiences that are hard to put words around. And, what it means, basically, kind of the pun intended here, is that how very often in relationships, how people interpret your colors depends less on your true colors and more on the social spot that you occupy in relation to those people who judge you. So, why the pyramid in the first place? Why do I use, this visual metaphor of a pyramid here? It's because the distribution of power and privilege in modern world still looks like a pyramid. So, even in the most kind of progressive countries, in Western democracies, everywhere, in third world, it's even more more pronounced. But even in the Western world, the distribution of power and privilege is still much like a pyramid. So we have very few people on the top, very few people who have, many privileges to them, economic privileges, identity privileges, and a lot of those unearned advantages. And then as we go lower on the pyramid, we see increasingly more people who don't have those unearned advantages and have unearned disadvantages, who are put in the position of disadvantage right off without any fault of their own, regardless of their effort, regardless of their talent, regardless of their capacities. So, in a way, the pyramid is, this kind of visual metaphor of the pyramid is the embodiment of power over, that kind of power where there are only so many people, namely at the top of the pyramid, who have the real ability to effect change. And let me tell you, the pyramid is the real thing, because, it describes very real and tangible societal dynamics. It's not just a figment of social activists' imagination, it's not just something that exists in our heads, but it's a model that accurately represents reality. And, the harder it is for you to acknowledge the reality of the pyramid, the more unacknowledged privilege you obviously have. So here's where the spot effect comes into play. If you imagine this pyramid as a kind of societal hierarchy, as a kind of structure of power, the structure of distribution of power and privilege in society. And so when two people who are at different positions in that pyramid, at kind of different levels of hierarchy, which is almost always the case because, there are so many dimensions of privilege in our lives that it's virtually impossible to find two people who are exactly equal when it comes to hierarchy. So almost in every relationship, we can see some inequality. It may be, bigger inequality or it may be smaller inequality, but it is real in the majority of relationships. So if you look at this, if you look at two people who are in a relationship, and if you look at the positions, at the different positions that they're at on the pyramid, then the person who stays lower, they would normally look up to those who stay higher. So they are socialized to smile, to be kind of nice, to be polite towards the ones staying higher. They are socialized to show attention and empathy, and in some extreme cases, it's even admiration or worshipping towards the one staying higher, towards the one that's more privileged. And they would hardly exhibit shitty behaviors towards that person, because since that person is higher, and since they have more power, they know that there will be accountability for shitty behaviors, that there will be consequences. So it is unlikely that if they do shit, they will get away with doing shit because of the external power dynamics that are already in place. So if you ask that person who is higher in this relationship what they think about the person staying lower, they will normally make judgments based on the behaviors that they experience with that person. And since those behaviors are most likely to be positive, it's exceedingly possible that they will think good of the person who in fact may be full of shit, who in fact may just suck up to them because of their money, power, fame, whatever benefits they can get. But now, if you look at the exact same person who was lower in that relationship, but now if you look at them in a different relationship, if you look at the very same person, but in a relationship with another person who, by contrast, is lower than they are on the pyramid, who is lower in social hierarchy, then it's quite probable that you will see different behaviors there. It's quite probable that in this relationship, they will leverage power dynamics in the opposite direction. It's quite probable that they will behave in dishonest, manipulative, abusive, gaslighting, or entitled ways. In ways that were not even remotely visible in the relationship with the first person, the person who was more privileged. And the reason why people feel free to show their true colors with less privileged people is because there's no accountability, There's license. So you can be rude to a Hispanic waiter, but you cannot because there will be no consequences. But you cannot be rude to your boss because there will be consequences, right? And so now, if you ask the less privileged person, they will tell you a very different relational experience with the subject that we're looking at. But that relational experience will be no less genuine. And unfortunately, their assessment of that person will be more accurate than the one given by someone staying higher on the hierarchy. Because here's the thing, like, if you're always shitty towards people who are less privileged than you, then how nice you are to your bosses, principals, sponsors, professors, and so on doesn't really matter. Because genuine kindness and genuine self-worth and genuine empathy, they come from within you, and they do not depend on social contexts. They do not depend on social pressures. They do not depend on some external power dynamics. If you're a kind person, not a person faking kindness with an agenda in the back of your mind, then you will be kind to everyone, even when you don't have to, and even when you can effectively get away with not practicing the values that you passionately preached. So that's why this is called one-way transparency, because someone else's true colors become quickly visible when you look at that person from a lower position upwards, but they aren't visible when you look at them from a higher position downwards. So that's why it is kind of one-way transparency. That's where the name comes from. And so, one of the people I interviewed gave me a description of that that may sound not very gentle, but I will mention it because I find it quite accurate. They said, when you're higher on the pyramid and you look down, all you see are the bleached, hypocritical, ingratiating smiles of those who are below you, because they want to benefit from your power. But when you are lower on the pyramid than this very same person, then what you see is their stinking dirty underwear. And they don't hesitate to spit, pee, and shit upon you. That might sound offensive to some people, but that is the truth. That is unfortunately the truth. So, the very tough and not so obvious implications from this are, much like when I studied privilege and when I kind of wrapped my head around 4 functions of privilege, there was a very tough lesson from that, because I understood that as much as I already know about my privilege, like a male privilege, white privilege, like cisgender privilege, there's still a lot about my privilege that I don't know, right? So there is, some amount of it that I've already explored, and then there is, probably a huge amount of privilege that still stays in my blind spot. And so in order to be really honest and empathetic and critically thinking, I have to be curious and receptive to other people's stories and never assume that I know enough about my privilege. So it's the same thing with the spot effect. Once you wrap your head around this concept, there are quite tough implications for your individual life and for your relationships. So the first is that, we have to cultivate solid, resilient self-worth, to develop a great degree of self-awareness, and to get crystal clear on our values and our intentions in relationships with others, in order to not become the living proofs of the spot effect, in order to treat everybody really equally, in order to just be ourselves in our relationships, instead of being the people that social pressures and social dynamics require us to show up as. And so that's easier said than done, but that's doable. And that's the work that we have to start doing together. And it's about authenticity. It's about the cultivation of authenticity. And the second implication here, which for me is the toughest, is that we have to practice critical awareness around our experiences with people that are lower than us or more or less equal with us on the pyramid, and understand that no matter how long we know someone, we may still not really know them as much as an underprivileged person will know them after 2 days of interacting with them. So, this happened to me so many times. Like, someone treated me like shit at work or in social circles. And then I would come to the person who introduced me and them to each other, and I would share my experience, and they would be like, Jorge, oh no, you must have gotten something wrong, or you must have taken things too seriously or too personally. Like, I know this person for 5 or 10 or 20 years, and what you tell me is not my experience with them. And so while earlier, such responses would kind of make me question my reality and my lived experience, these days they no longer do, because I say, of course, that's not your experience with that person. Of course, it's not your experience. Because, mind how privileged you are compared to them, and how disadvantaged I am compared to them. Doesn't it occur to you how big of a blind spot you might experience in your relationship with them, no matter how long it has been? And so if people gaslight me further, these days I just walk away from the conversation. I no longer stay in it, because I know that privilege awareness is hard, and it's not my job or my responsibility to teach other people to rumble with discomfort. It's their own job. It's not my job. What remains my job is that there were, there are, and there will be people in my life that are much less privileged than I am. People who stay much lower on the hierarchy of power than I do. And so, if some of those people one day comes to me and they tell me about their experience with someone that I already know, with someone who's my friend, someone who I think I've known for ages, someone who's always been kind and empathetic and friendly towards me, and then they tell me, quite a different relational experience with that person, then, as long as I recognize the imbalance of power and privilege, it is my job to accept that they see that person's true colors more accurately than I do. It's just real. It's just the truth. And not only is this a function of empathy, namely perspective taking, that you believe people's stories the way they tell them to you, especially when there's, power and privilege imbalance at play. But, it's also the acknowledgement of the fact that narcissists, especially covert narcissists, can be very, very good at looking good towards those that they need to look good for. And so sometimes it's very hard to spot a narcissist. Sometimes you may be in a relationship with a person and not be able to spot a narcissist in them for years and decades. Because, it's virtually impossible to register narcissistic behaviors from someone if that person constantly gets what they want to get from you. And, they may be getting something from me, something that I might not be even aware of. But they may be effectively getting it, and that is the reason why they treat me with kindness and empathy, and why they are, and the reason why in my presence they behave like a kind and empathetic person towards everybody else. Why in my presence they talk about justice and kindness and empathy and equality and all those things. But that is just Hollywood, And it's my job to believe the people whose vulnerability in relationships with them is bigger than mine. Not because of their conscious choice to be vulnerable, but because of external, objective social dynamics. As I wrote on Instagram a few years ago, it is from the position of vulnerability that people's true colors become readily visible. And if I stay higher than them or equal with them on the social pyramid, I will never get nearly as vulnerable as people who stay significantly lower. So it is my job to believe those people more than I believe my own obviously biased impression. So I do hope you take this message constructively, and I would love to have a conversation with y'all. In the comments below, please share with me how you have seen or experienced the spot effect in your life and your relationships. As always, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time on Jorge Ores YouTube channel. Be brave, stay curious, keep telling the truth, and take care, guys. Bye.